My husband had just stepped away from the table to take a phone call when the woman in the corner booth caught my eye. She was older than me, maybe mid-70s, wearing a pale blue cardigan despite the August heat. She'd been sitting there alone for a while, nursing what looked like a cup of tea that had gone cold. I hadn't paid her much attention until that moment, until she stood up, walked directly toward me, and sat down in my husband's empty chair like she'd been waiting for permission to do exactly that. "I'm sorry to startle you," she said. Her voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that doesn't need to raise itself to be heard. "But I've been trying to decide whether to come over for the last 20 minutes. I remember looking around almost reflexively to see if anyone else was watching. The restaurant, Haverford's, this old money steakhouse downtown where my husband loved to take clients, was half empty on a Tuesday evening. The hostess was busy near the entrance. No one was paying attention to us. "Do I know you?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, but I know who your husband is." She reached into her purse and set something on the table between us. A white envelope sealed, my name on the front. Not my full name, just Cecilia, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. "Don't open it here," she said, "and don't tell him I gave it to you." I wanted to say something, ask her who she was, how she knew my name, what on earth was inside that envelope. But before I could form a single word, she stood back up, picked up her purse, and walked straight toward the exit without looking back. My husband came back to the table 3 minutes later, slipping his phone into his jacket pocket, apologizing for the interruption, asking if I'd ordered another glass of wine. I said no. I smiled. I sat through the rest of that dinner with an envelope tucked inside my cardigan, pressed against my ribs, and my heart doing something it had never quite done before, a dull, heavy knock that said you already know something is wrong, you just haven't admitted it yet. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further. My name is Cecilia Oakes, and I am 63 years old. I have been married to my husband for 11 years. I taught high school English for 28 years before I retired, and I have spent most of my adult life believing that I was a reasonably good judge of character. I say reasonably because I married him. His name is Warren Oakes. He is charming in the way that certain men are charming. Effortlessly, selectively, in a way that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room when his attention lands on you. I know how that sounds now. I know how it always sounds in retrospect. But when we met, I was 52 and had been a widow for 4 years, and Warren was attentive and funny and never seemed to mind that I was opinionated and set in my ways. My daughter from my first marriage, she was in her mid-20s then, told me she had a bad feeling about him from the beginning. I told her she just needed time to get to know him. I spent a lot of years being wrong about that. That night after dinner, after Warren fell asleep with the television still on, I took the envelope into the bathroom, sat down on the edge of the tub, and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper and a business card for a woman named Agatha Crane, listed as a retired paralegal in Kirkfield County, and a handwritten note that said only this: "He's done this before. Ask about Maureen Holloway. 2009. Polk County Probate Court. I'm sorry I didn't find you sooner." I read it 4 times. Then I folded it back up, tucked it inside my copy of the Merck manual that I keep under the bathroom sink. Warren never touches it. He hates anything medical, and went back to bed. I didn't sleep. The name didn't mean anything to me. Maureen Holloway. I turned it over in my mind like a pebble, looking for something familiar on it, finding nothing. I'd heard Warren mention Polk County once or twice. He'd lived there before we met. Briefly during what he called a transitional period. He never elaborated. I'd never pushed. The next morning, Warren left early for a meeting. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and typed Maureen Holloway, Polk County, into the search bar on my laptop. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself this was probably nothing. The first result was an obituary from 2011. Maureen Holloway, 71, beloved mother of two, retired schoolteacher, passed away at Polk County Medical Center after a brief illness. She was preceded in death by her first husband and survived by her children and two grandchildren. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations to the Alzheimer's Association. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I searched Maureen Holloway plus Warren plus Polk County Probate Court. Nothing came up directly, but the obituary mentioned a daughter, Tabitha Crane. And when I searched Tabitha Crane, Polk County, I found a small notice in the archives of the Kirkfield Gazette from 2009, a civil case filing, Crane v. Holloway Estate, contesting the amendment of a will. Holloway Estate, a woman who had died 2 years after marrying a man named Warren. I didn't know his last name at that point, not from these records, who had, in the final months of her life, amended her will to leave the majority of her assets to her new husband rather than to her children. I put my coffee cup down. My hands were shaking. I found the business card. I dialed the number. The woman who answered sounded like someone who had been waiting for a call she wasn't sure would ever come. "You met my mother," I said. She exhaled. "I've been watching for the right moment for 6 months," she said. "She wanted to approach you herself. She kept saying it had to be her." Her mother's name was Harriet, but not the Harriet from the list, so let me be precise. Her mother was the woman in the blue cardigan, Agatha's mother, and the name on Agatha's business card was a professional one she still used from her paralegal years. Agatha had been the one doing the research. Her mother had been the one who insisted on delivering the message personally. Because Agatha's mother had known Maureen Holloway, they'd been in the same church choir for 11 years. She told me the story slowly, in the careful, measured way of someone who has been holding it a long time. Maureen had been a widow, comfortable, but not wealthy. A pension, a paid-off house in a quiet neighborhood, some savings, and a life insurance policy that had been intended for her children since before they were born. She'd been lonely after her husband died. She'd met a man at a church function, someone charming and attentive, who told her she was the most interesting person in the room. His name at that time had been Warren Aldrich. Maureen had married him in 2007. By 2008, Agatha's mother noticed that Maureen seemed confused at times, easily overwhelmed, sometimes not quite herself. By 2009, Maureen had signed a new will. Her daughter Tabitha had filed a legal challenge. By the time the case wound through the courts, Maureen had died, and Warren had already sold the house and relocated. He became Warren Oaks sometime around 2010. I found that part out later. "Why didn't Tabitha warn me?" I asked. "She tried," Agatha said quietly. "She reached out to a few people online. Nothing came of it. She was exhausted by then, and she'd spent most of her savings on the legal fight. She lives out of state now." A pause. "My mother never forgave herself for not doing more when Maureen was still alive. She's 80 years old, and she drove 40 minutes to that restaurant and sat there for 2 hours waiting for the right moment. She wanted to be the one to tell you." I sat in my kitchen for a long time after I hung up. The dishwasher was running. Outside, a neighbor was mowing his lawn. Everything around me was ordinary and loud and completely untouched by what I was holding in my hands. I thought about what I had. I was 63, not incapacitated, not isolated. I had my daughter, I had friends from my teaching years, I had my own retirement account that I'd set up before the marriage and never merged with Warren's finances because something in me had always been careful about that without quite knowing why. I owned half of the house we lived in jointly. I had a functional brain and 28 years of experience dealing with situations where the facts didn't match the story being told to me. What I didn't have was time, because whatever Warren was planning, it was already in motion. I could feel it the way you can feel a change in weather before it arrives. 2 weeks after that dinner at Haverford's, Warren suggested we update our wills. He brought it up at breakfast, casually, the way he brought up everything, sideways, like it wasn't something he'd been thinking about. He said his financial advisor had recommended it. He said at our ages, he was 67, it was just responsible planning. He said he'd already called a lawyer. I said that sounded reasonable and asked which lawyer. He named someone I'd never heard of, a firm downtown with a name that meant nothing to me. I said I'd look into it. That afternoon, while Warren was at the gym, I called my own lawyer. Her name is Joan Hathaway, and she's been practicing estate law in this county for 30 years. I told her everything: the woman at the restaurant, Agatha Crane, Maureen Holloway, the name Warren Aldridge, the Polk County probate case. Joan listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "Don't sign anything," she said, "and get me access to everything you can find. Financial accounts, deeds, any documents that came into the house in the last year. Do it quietly." I was quiet about it. I had learned by that point how to be quiet in a marriage where information was kept in separate drawers. What I found over the next 3 weeks was this: Warren had taken out a home equity line of credit against our house 6 months earlier, using a forged version of my signature. He'd drawn down $40,000. The account was connected to a separate banking institution I'd never heard of, under a slightly different variation of our joint address. The documents were good enough that they'd cleared initial processing, but not good enough to survive a forensic accountant's scrutiny. Joan brought in a forensic accountant. She also quietly contacted the Polk County court system and requested records from the Crane v. Holloway estate case. Those records, combined with the name change filing she found through a private investigator, confirmed what we already suspected: Warren Oakes and Warren Aldridge were the same person. I will tell you that the 3 weeks between finding this out and doing anything about it were the longest of my life. I went to dinner with my husband. I watched television with my husband. I listened to him complain about traffic and comment on the news and talk about the trip he wanted to take in the fall. I smiled and nodded and made coffee in the mornings, and all the while I was thinking about Maureen Holloway, who had sung in a choir and had a pension and a paid-off house and 2 children who loved her, and who had died not knowing what had happened to everything she'd spent her life building. I thought about her a lot. My daughter, her name is Petra. She's 34. She lives 40 minutes away and teaches preschool and has been suspicious of Warren since the day they met. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon and told her everything. She was silent for a long time. "Mom," she finally said, "how long have you known?" 3 weeks. "And you've just been sitting there with him every day?" "I needed to be sure," I said, "and I needed everything in order before I moved." She drove over that same night. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and we went through everything Joan had prepared: the forged signature documentation, the name change records, the forensic accounting report, the Polk County case files. Petra is not a crier. She gets very still when she's upset, very precise. She read everything slowly, And when she was done, she folded her hands on the table and said, "What do you need me to do?" The following Monday, while Warren was at his so-called financial advisor's office, I'd had Jones' investigator confirm that the advisor was real, a small operation that appeared to be entirely legitimate and unconnected to Warren's other activities, which told us Warren was compartmentalizing carefully. I met with Joan and we filed a fraud report with the county sheriff's office. I also filed an emergency injunction to freeze the home equity line of credit pending investigation of the forged signature. Joan had done this kind of work before. She was efficient and calm, and she told me exactly what to expect, which was that things were going to move faster than I thought, and I needed to be ready. She was right. Warren came home from his meeting to find 2 county detectives in his living room. I wasn't there for that part. Joan had strongly recommended I be elsewhere, at Petra's specifically, and I listened to her. But Petra told me later, after we found out, that Warren had apparently remained calm at first, polite even. He'd asked to see a warrant, he'd asked for a lawyer, he'd maintained the same easy sideways manner he used for everything. It didn't hold. The detectives had the forged document, they had the financial records, they had the name change filing, and a certified copy of the Polk County case. And when they made clear that they'd already spoken with Tabitha, Maureen Holloway's daughter, who had agreed to provide a deposition, something in Warren shifted, according to the detective who later filled Joan in on the sequence of events. He stopped being polite. The DA's office took it from there. It turned out the home equity line wasn't the only thing. Warren had also, quietly, been attempting to get me to sign over power of attorney. The document had been prepared. Joan found it in a file at the lawyer's office Warren had recommended. And the plan, as far as investigators could reconstruct it, was to use the power of attorney to access my retirement accounts and initiate a sale of my half of the house. He'd apparently done a version of this with at least one other woman between Maureen and me, though that case was in another state and the details were still being worked out when I last spoke with Joan about it. He was charged in our county with forgery, financial fraud, and elder financial abuse. The Polk County DA reopened the Holloway matter based on the new evidence. Tabitha, Maureen's daughter, finally got her day in court, 11 years after she'd first filed that challenge. I don't know, even now, whether she got everything back. But I know she got something. And I know that Warren Aldridge, who became Warren Oakes, who sat across from me at dinner tables and complained about traffic and poured himself 2 fingers of bourbon every evening at 7 o'clock, was going to spend a long time answering for what he'd done. He pled guilty 18 months later to avoid trial. The judge sentenced him to 9 years. His assets, what remained of them, were ordered partially liquidated to satisfy restitution claims from both estates. I finalized my divorce before the sentencing. Joan handled that too. Here is what I want you to know, if you've stayed with me this long. I am not a cautious person by nature. I am opinionated and stubborn, and I trusted my own judgment for decades in ways that sometimes served me and sometimes didn't. I missed things I shouldn't have missed. I dismissed a warning from my own daughter for years because I wanted to be right about a choice I'd made. But there was a woman in a pale blue cardigan who drove 40 minutes in August heat and sat in a restaurant for 2 hours, who was 80 years old and did not have to do any of that, who did it anyway because her friend Maureen had no one to do it for her. I think about that a lot. I think about what it means to show up for a stranger because you failed to show up for someone you loved, and the courage it takes to try to make that right, even when you know you can't. Not really. Not completely. Agatha's mother and I have had coffee 3 times now. She is sharp and funny, and she still sings. Not in a choir anymore, but sometimes around the house, she says. Her daughter calls to check on her every Sunday. We don't talk about Warren much. Mostly we talk about Maureen, about the kind of person she was, about the choir and the neighborhood she'd lived in for 40 years, and the grandchildren she loved. I think Maureen deserved better than what happened to her. I think a lot of women do, and I think the least I can do, the absolute least, is tell her story alongside mine so that maybe someone out there, sitting across a dinner table from someone charming, feeling that dull knock in the chest that says something is wrong, will listen to it. Don't wait to be sure. Trust the knock. And if a stranger sits down across from you and hands you a sealed envelope, don't open it in the restaurant. Go home, find a good lawyer, and call your daughter. I keep coming back to a small detail that shouldn't matter as much as it does. The tea had gone cold. She had been sitting in that restaurant long enough for her tea to go cold. An 80-year-old woman who drove 40 minutes in August heat and waited because she had failed to act for someone she loved, and she was not going to fail again. That's not something you can manufacture. That's not something that comes from nowhere. That is what happens when a person has lived long enough to understand that doing nothing is also a choice, and that the weight of that choice doesn't lighten with time. I think about cause and effect a lot these days, not in any mystical way, just in the plain, observable way that actions accumulate. Warren made choices quietly over years. He chose to become a different person on paper. He chose to find women who were alone and trusting and had spent their lives building something. He chose to be careful and patient and charming. And every one of those choices pulled a thread that eventually, inevitably led somewhere. It led to a forensic accountant sitting at my kitchen table. It led to a judge in a courtroom. It led to 9 years. And Agatha's mother made choices too. She chose to remember Maureen. She chose not to let the discomfort of approaching a stranger outweigh the cost of staying quiet. One woman's refusal to look away set in motion everything that followed. The lawyer, the investigation, the case in Polk County finally reopened. Tabitha finally heard. That is how it actually works. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just choice and consequence and time. What I wish someone had told me earlier, what I would tell anyone who is sitting where I was sitting, is that clear thinking is not cold thinking. I loved Warren, or I loved who I believed he was, and I still made myself read those documents carefully. I still called Joan. I still built a case before I moved. Petra always said I was stubborn. She wasn't wrong. But stubbornness, when it's pointed in the right direction, is just another word for not giving up on the truth, because the truth is inconvenient. I was not born careful about my finances. I became careful because something in me, some quiet, persistent instinct, kept saying, keep this separate, keep this yours. I didn't know why at the time. Looking back, I think that instinct was doing the work that my conscious mind wasn't ready to do yet. Listening to it, not talking myself out of it, was maybe the most important thing I did in that marriage. And then there is the matter of showing up. Agatha's mother showed up. Petra showed up the same night I called her. Joan showed up with 30 years of knowledge and not a single moment of hesitation. I did not get through this alone. No one does. The story we tell about the lone person who outsmarts the predator is a tidy story, but it isn't the real one. The real one involves an old woman who remembered her friend, and a daughter who drove 40 minutes without being asked twice, and a lawyer who said, "Don't sign anything," before I even finished explaining. Maureen didn't have that network in place when she needed it. I think about that more than anything. I think about what her life might have looked like if one person, just one, had shown up sooner. Be that person for someone, and make sure you have those people too.